The radar screens at Nellis Air Force Base painted a picture that defied explanation. At 3:47 hours, controllers watched in stunned silence as an unidentified aircraft materialized from nowhere, moving at impossible angles through restricted airspace. The signature was wrong, too small for a fighter, too fast for civilian traffic, yet somehow dancing through electromagnetic barriers that should have been impenetrable. "Control, I'm seeing something that can't be there," whispered Technical Sergeant Martinez, her voice barely audible over the hum of monitoring equipment. The blip moved like liquid mercury across her screen, defying every law of physics she'd learned in 20 years of air traffic control. Command frequencies crackled with confusion as senior officers gathered around the displays, their faces illuminated by the ghostly green glow of technology struggling to comprehend what it observed. Major General Richardson pushed through the crowd, his weathered features hardening as he studied the anomaly. "Get me identification on that aircraft. Now." But even as he spoke, they all knew this was beyond normal protocol. The object, whatever it was, seemed to phase in and out of radar coverage, appearing simultaneously at multiple coordinates that geometry declared impossible. 3,000 feet above the Nevada desert, Lieutenant Colonel Vivian Wraith, Blackhawk felt her F-22 Raptor shudder as electromagnetic interference cascaded through her instruments. Static filled her headset, punctuated by fragments of panicked radio chatter from ground control. Through her canopy, stars wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed subtly wrong, as if the very fabric of space had developed wrinkles. "Nelly's control, Wraith 17 requesting vector to anomaly," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting across all frequencies. But her radio returned only silence, the kind of profound, cosmic silence that made seasoned pilots question their sanity. Her heads-up display flickered between normal flight parameters and data streams that belonged in science fiction. 27 years of military aviation had taught Blackhawk to trust her instincts over instruments when reality became negotiable. Tonight, every instinct screamed that something fundamental had shifted in the airspace above Nevada. The desert below stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with the distant lights of Las Vegas, while above her, the aurora-like phenomenon pulsed with colors that had no names. Her call sign had been earned through 7 combat tours, countless classified missions, and a reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home when others would have ejected. Fellow pilots whispered that Wraith could fly through dimensions, appearing and disappearing like her namesake. Tonight, as electromagnetic chaos rewrote the rules of flight, that legend would either be confirmed or become her epitaph. Ground control continued their frantic attempts to establish contact, unaware that high above the desert, one pilot was about to discover that some mysteries could only be solved by flying directly into the impossible. The anomaly pulsed once more, and Vivian Blackhawk banked hard toward the unknown, her Raptor's engine screaming defiance at the gathering storm of impossibility that waited in the star-scattered darkness ahead. In her headset, silence reigned supreme, broken only by the steady rhythm of her own breathing as she prepared to confront whatever had transformed the familiar sky into something alien and magnificent. Static electricity danced across her canopy as she entered the phenomenon's outer edge. Her instruments began displaying readings that violated every principle of aerodynamics she'd ever learned. Yet Wraith 17 flew on, guided by instincts honed through decades of dancing with death in the unforgiving realm between Earth and space. The mystery deepened with each passing second as electromagnetic interference transformed her sophisticated fighter into little more than aluminum and determination. But Vivian Blackhawk had faced worse odds before. In skies where enemy fire painted deadly constellations and survival depended on split-second decisions made in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Below, Nelly's control watched helplessly as their most experienced pilot disappeared into a phenomenon that challenged everything they thought they knew about flight. The radar screens showed nothing now but empty sky, while somewhere in the darkness above, a legend was about to be born from the ashes of technological impossibility. Radio silence stretched across the desert like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. In that silence, the true test of a pilot's skill would reveal itself, not through advanced technology or superior firepower, but through the ancient art of reading the wind and trusting the sky to carry those brave enough to surrender themselves to its mysterious currents. Colonel Martinez adjusted her headset and tried once more to establish contact with Wraith 17, her voice echoing into the electromagnetic void that had swallowed one of their finest pilots. The screens around her remained stubbornly blank, offering no clues about the fate of the woman who had earned her call sign by mastering the impossible art of becoming one with the darkness itself. At Andrews Air Force Base, 3,000 miles away, phones began ringing in the pre-dawn darkness. Senior Pentagon officials stirred from sleep as encrypted communications networks carried whispered reports of the Nevada incident, a phenomenon that would be classified at the highest levels before sunrise. But no classification could contain what was unfolding in the skies above the desert, where traditional boundaries between possible and impossible had begun to dissolve. The electromagnetic anomaly continued its mysterious dance through restricted airspace, seemingly aware of the chaos it was generating among military installations across the southwestern United States. Radar operators from Arizona to Colorado reported similar signatures, each one defying explanation while simultaneously suggesting a pattern too complex for human comprehension. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Pentagon's leading expert on atmospheric anomalies, received her summons at 4:12 hours. As she dressed quickly in the darkness of her Arlington apartment, she had no way of knowing that her careful scientific worldview was about to be challenged by evidence that would force her to reconsider everything she thought she understood about the relationship between consciousness and reality. Meanwhile, high above the Nevada desert, Vivian Blackhawk continued her lonely journey into the unknown. Her F-22s engines maintained their steady roar, the only constant in a universe that seemed increasingly fluid. The stars above had arranged themselves in configurations she didn't recognize, while below, the familiar lights of civilization flickered like candles in an electromagnetic storm. Her training at the Air Force Test Pilot School had prepared her for many contingencies, but nothing in the curriculum had covered navigation through space that bent according to rules written by an intelligence beyond human understanding. Yet she flew on, guided by instincts that recognized no difference between natural and supernatural, only the eternal challenge of maintaining controlled flight through whatever conditions the sky chose to present. The radio crackled suddenly, fragments of voices breaking through the electromagnetic barrier that had isolated her from ground control. But the words were strange, spoken in accents she didn't recognize, discussing aircraft and tactical situations that seemed to belong to a different war entirely. Blackhawk listened intently, trying to decode the meaning hidden within the fractured communications that leaked through the anomaly's boundaries. As her fuel gauges registered normal consumption despite impossible flight conditions, she began to understand that this mission would test more than her piloting skills. Something in the phenomenon was evaluating her, measuring her responses to challenges that existed beyond the conventional boundaries of military aviation. The realization brought not fear, but excitement, the same electric anticipation she'd felt before every combat mission, magnified by the knowledge that tonight's flight would redefine her understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. Her call sign had always seemed appropriate, but now it felt prophetic. In this realm where electromagnetic laws bent like heated metal, Vivian Wraith, Blackhawk, was discovering that some legends were born not through exaggeration, but through the simple act of flying into mysteries that lesser pilots would never dare to approach. The phenomenon pulsed around her aircraft like a living thing, and she smiled grimly as she realized that Whatever intelligence controlled this space had been waiting for someone exactly like her. Ground control's desperate attempts to reestablish contact continued to echo through her headset, their voices growing more distant with each transmission. But Blackhawk was no longer concerned with returning to the familiar world of regulations and standard procedures. She had found something in the electromagnetic darkness that called to every instinct that had made her a pilot, the promise of flight beyond the boundaries that confined earthbound imagination. The anomaly shifted suddenly, revealing glimpses of landscape that couldn't possibly exist above the Nevada desert. Blackhawk saw forests that glowed with their own inner light, cities arranged in geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate directly, and skies that contained layers of reality stacked like pages in an infinite book. Her aircraft responded to controls with fluid grace, as if the phenomenon had enhanced rather than hindered her Raptor's capabilities. In that moment of perfect clarity, she understood why her call sign had frozen seasoned F-22 pilots during training exercises. They had sensed something in her flying that transcended conventional skill, an ability to navigate spaces that existed in the margins between what was known and what was possible. Tonight, in the electromagnetic storms above Nevada, that ability would either prove her greatest strength or lead her into darkness from which no pilot could return. But Vivian Blackhawk had never been one to retreat from challenges that promised to expand the boundaries of human flight. Her engines sang their defiant song into the strange harmonics of the anomaly, carrying her deeper into mysteries that would reshape everything military aviation thought it understood about the relationship between pilot, aircraft, and the infinite sky that contained them all. The radar screens at Nellie's remained blank, but Colonel Martinez continued her vigil, somehow sensing that their missing pilot was not lost but transformed. In the control room's green-tinted darkness, experienced operators whispered theories that sounded more like mythology than meteorology, while overhead, the electromagnetic phenomenon continued its patient dance with forces that existed beyond the reach of human technology. Dr. Chen's aircraft lifted off from Andrews, carrying her toward revelations that would challenge her scientific worldview in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As she studied the preliminary data during the flight, she began to suspect that the Nevada incident represented something unprecedented in the annals of atmospheric research, a phenomenon that seemed to respond to human consciousness in ways that violated every principle of physics she held dear. The morning sun began its slow rise over the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across military installations, where senior officers were beginning to comprehend that their understanding of airspace control had become suddenly, dramatically obsolete. Phone conversations between Washington and Nevada took on an urgency typically reserved for international crises, while classified databases began accumulating files that would remain sealed for decades to come. High above the desert, Vivian Blackhawk continued her exploration of impossible flight conditions, her Raptor moving through electromagnetic fields that painted aurora-like patterns across her canopy. The phenomenon had revealed its true nature as something that existed at the intersection of technology and consciousness, challenging every assumption about the limitations of human flight, while offering glimpses of capabilities that transcended conventional aviation. Her fuel gauges continued to register normal levels despite maneuvers that should have consumed twice the standard load. The anomaly seemed to be sustaining her aircraft through methods that belonged more to speculation than engineering, allowing her to maintain controlled flight through conditions that would have grounded any other pilot within minutes of initial contact. Radio communications from ground control faded into whispers, then silence, as the electromagnetic interference isolated her completely from the familiar world of regulations and procedures. But Blackhawk felt no anxiety at this separation, only the profound satisfaction of a pilot who had finally found flight conditions worthy of her capabilities. Whatever intelligence controlled this phenomenon understood her in ways that her fellow officers never had. The stars above had arranged themselves into patterns that seemed deliberately meaningful, as if the sky itself was trying to communicate through the ancient language of navigation that had guided pilots since the dawn of aviation. Black Hawk read these stellar configurations with instincts honed through years of night flying, finding in their arrangements a kind of map that pointed toward possibilities she had never imagined. Her breathing settled into the steady rhythm that marked extended periods of concentration, the same pattern that had sustained her through combat missions, where a single moment of inattention could prove fatal. But tonight's flight demanded a different kind of focus, not the hypervigilance of aerial warfare, but the meditative awareness required to navigate spaces that existed between dimensions of conventional reality. The electromagnetic anomaly pulsed with increasing intensity, its effects rippling through the sophisticated electronics of her F-22 in ways that enhanced rather than disrupted their function. Her heads-up display began showing navigation data that corresponded to no charts she had ever studied, yet somehow felt familiar, as if her subconscious had been preparing for this flight throughout her entire career. Below, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but Black Hawk could see that she was no longer flying above the landscape she knew. The terrain had subtly shifted, revealing geological features that existed in no earthly geography, while maintaining enough familiarity to prevent complete disorientation. She was learning to navigate a realm where physical laws remained consistent enough to sustain flight, while allowing for possibilities that existed beyond conventional limitations. Her call sign took on new significance as she realized that the ability to appear and disappear, to move through spaces that other pilots couldn't access, was not metaphorical but literal. The electromagnetic phenomenon had recognized something in her flying that transcended normal skill, drawing her into a realm where the boundary between pilot and aircraft dissolved into something approaching pure flight consciousness. Colonel Martinez maintained her position at the radar console, her experienced operator's instincts telling her that Wraith 17 had not crashed, but had instead entered a phase of flight that existed beyond the reach of conventional tracking systems. Around her, the control room buzzed with theories and speculation, but she remained focused on the empty screen where Black Hawk's signature had vanished, somehow certain that their most skilled pilot was not lost but transformed. The Pentagon's crisis management protocols activated smoothly, creating secure communication channels between military installations across the continent, as reports of similar electromagnetic anomalies began filtering in from radar stations in multiple time zones. What had begun as a local Nevada incident was revealing itself as something far more comprehensive, a phenomenon that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of controlled airspace. Dr. Chen's transport aircraft approached Nevada airspace as the sun climbed higher, its rays beginning to illuminate a desert landscape that had been transformed by forces beyond current scientific understanding. Her instruments detected electromagnetic signatures unlike anything in the published literature, suggesting that the atmosphere above Nevada had become a laboratory for physics that existed beyond the boundaries of terrestrial research. High in the electromagnetic storm, Vivian Blackhawk discovered that her aircraft had become an extension of her consciousness in ways that training had never prepared her to understand. The Raptor responded to her thoughts with precision that transcended the mechanical interface between pilot and machine, creating a synthesis of human intuition and technological capability that approached the theoretical limits of aerodynamic possibility. Her fuel consumption had stabilized at levels that defied every principle of thermodynamics, yet her instruments registered normal engine function across all parameters. The phenomenon was sustaining her flight through methods that belonged to realms of science that existed decades ahead of current research, offering her glimpses of capabilities that would reshape military aviation if they could be understood and replicated. The radio silence that surrounded her had become profound, cutting her off from ground control while simultaneously connecting her to communication frequencies that seemed to originate from sources beyond terrestrial transmission. Voices speaking in languages She didn't recognize discussed tactical situations and flight procedures that belonged to no earthly military, offering fragmentary insights into aerospace capabilities that transcended current technology. Her navigation instruments had adapted to display information that corresponded to no charts in any database, yet somehow provided guidance that felt more reliable than conventional GPS systems. The electromagnetic anomaly was teaching her aircraft to navigate through dimensions of space that existed parallel to normal flight corridors, opening passages between points that conventional geometry declared impossible. Blackhawk's breathing remained steady as she processed information that challenged every assumption about the limits of human flight. Her training had prepared her to adapt to changing conditions, but nothing in the curriculum had covered navigation through space that responded to consciousness as much as control inputs. Yet she flew on, guided by instincts that recognized no fundamental difference between natural and supernatural flight conditions. The phenomenon pulsed around her with increasing intensity, its electromagnetic fields creating visual effects that painted her canopy with colors that existed beyond the normal spectrum. Through these aurora-like displays, she began to perceive landscape features that belonged to no earthly geography, cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, forests that grew according to principles that transcended conventional biology, skis that contained layers of reality stacked like pages in an infinite atlas. Her call sign had earned its power through years of training exercises, where she had demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend conventional piloting skills. Fellow officers had whispered that Wraith could navigate through dimensions that other pilots couldn't access, appearing and disappearing in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions of aerial warfare. Tonight, in the electromagnetic storms above Nevada, those whispers were being validated by phenomena that existed beyond the reach of skepticism. Ground control's attempts to reestablish contact continued to echo through frequencies that seemed increasingly distant, their voices fading into whispers that belonged to a world she was rapidly leaving behind. But Blackhawk felt no regret at this separation, only the profound satisfaction of a pilot who had finally discovered flight conditions that matched her capabilities to challenges worthy of her skill. The stars above had arranged themselves into navigational patterns that belonged to no earthly astronomy, yet provided guidance that felt more reliable than any GPS system ever devised. She read these stellar configurations with instincts developed through decades of night flying, finding in their arrangements a kind of cosmic map that pointed toward destinations she had never imagined possible. Her aircraft had become something more than the sum of its mechanical components, transformed by the electromagnetic phenomenon into a vehicle capable of navigating spaces that existed between dimensions of conventional reality. The F-22's sophisticated systems had evolved beyond their original specifications, developing capabilities that would revolutionize aerospace engineering if they could be understood and replicated in terrestrial laboratories. Colonel Martinez refused to abandon her post despite pressure from superior officers who wanted to declare Wraith 17 missing and presumed lost. Her radar screen remained stubbornly blank, but years of experience told her that absence of conventional tracking data didn't necessarily indicate catastrophic failure. Some pilots, she knew, possessed abilities that transcended the limitations of standard monitoring systems. The electromagnetic anomaly continued its mysterious dance through restricted airspace, generating effects that rippled across military installations from coast to coast, while maintaining the enigmatic patterns that had first captured the attention of Nellie's control. Whatever intelligence guided this phenomenon was demonstrating capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and reality in ways that would require decades of research to fully comprehend. Dr. Chen's aircraft entered Nevada airspace as the morning sun reached its zenith, illuminating a landscape that had been subtly transformed by forces beyond current scientific understanding. Her preliminary readings suggested that the atmosphere above the desert had become a natural laboratory for physics that existed at the cutting edge of theoretical research, offering opportunities for discoveries that could revolutionize humanity's understanding of flight itself. High in the electromagnetic storm, Vivian Wraith, Blackhawk had discovered that the boundary between pilot and aircraft was far more fluid than conventional training suggested. Her consciousness had merged with her Raptor's systems in ways that created a synthesis of human intuition and technological capability, producing flight characteristics that approached the theoretical limits of what was possible within the known laws of aerodynamics. The phenomenon surrounding her aircraft pulsed with energy patterns that seemed to respond to her thoughts and emotions, creating a feedback loop between her consciousness and the electromagnetic fields that sustained impossible flight conditions. Through this interaction, she was learning to navigate spaces that existed beyond the reach of conventional physics, while maintaining the controlled flight characteristics that defined professional aviation. Her call sign took on prophetic significance, as she realized that the ability to move through dimensions that other pilots couldn't access was not metaphorical but literal. The electromagnetic anomaly had recognized something in her flying that transcended normal skill, drawing her into realms where the fundamental nature of flight itself could be explored and redefined through direct experience rather than theoretical speculation. Radio communications from familiar frequencies had faded into silence, replaced by transmissions that seemed to originate from sources beyond terrestrial broadcasting. Voices discussing tactical situations and flight procedures that belonged to no earthly military offered fragmentary glimpses into aerospace capabilities that existed decades ahead of current technology, suggesting that her journey was leading toward discoveries that would reshape humanity's understanding of controlled flight. The Nevada desert below had transformed into landscape that obeyed geometric principles beyond terrestrial geography, while maintaining enough familiar features to prevent complete disorientation. She was learning to navigate terrain that existed at the intersection of multiple dimensions, where conventional maps became obsolete and navigation depended on instincts that had been developing throughout her entire career without her conscious awareness. Her fuel gauges continued to register normal consumption despite flight conditions that should have exhausted her reserves within the first hour of contact with the anomaly. The phenomenon was sustaining her aircraft through methods that belonged to realms of science that existed beyond current understanding, offering practical demonstrations of principles that would revolutionize aerospace engineering if they could be successfully analyzed and replicated. The electromagnetic fields surrounding her Raptor had begun displaying visual effects that painted her canopy with aurora-like patterns containing colors that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human perception. Through these luminous displays, she could perceive structural details of the anomaly that revealed its nature as something far more complex than atmospheric disturbance, an intelligence that existed at the intersection of consciousness and technology. Ground control's desperate attempts to reestablish contact had become whispers that belonged to a world she was rapidly transcending, their voices fading into electromagnetic static as her aircraft moved deeper into realms where conventional communication systems became obsolete. But Blackhawk felt no anxiety at this separation, only the profound recognition that she had discovered flight conditions that matched her capabilities to challenges worthy of her skill. Her breathing had settled into patterns that marked extended periods of deep concentration, the same rhythms that had sustained her through combat missions, where survival depended on maintaining perfect focus despite impossible odds. But tonight's flight demanded a different kind of awareness, not the hypervigilance of aerial warfare, but the meditative consciousness required to navigate spaces that existed between dimensions of normal reality. The stars above continued their mysterious rearrangement into navigational patterns that belonged to no earthly astronomy, yet provided guidance that felt more reliable than any technological system she had ever used. These celestial configurations seemed to respond to her consciousness in ways that created a kind of cosmic dialogue, with stellar positions shifting to indicate optimal flight paths through electromagnetic terrain that existed beyond conventional mapping systems. Her aircraft had evolved beyond its original specifications, transformed by the phenomenon into something that approached the theoretical ideal of perfect flight, a vehicle capable of responding to consciousness as readily as control inputs, while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for navigation through conditions that would destroy conventional aircraft within minutes of exposure to the anomaly's effects. Colonel Martinez maintained her vigil at the radar console despite increasing pressure from superior officers who wanted to classify the incident and move on to more conventional concerns. Her experience told her that Wraith 17 had not been lost, but had instead entered a phase of flight that existed beyond the reach of traditional tracking systems, requiring patience and faith rather than standard search and rescue procedures. The electromagnetic anomaly continued its patient dance through restricted airspace, generating effects that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of controlled flight, while demonstrating capabilities that existed at the cutting edge of theoretical physics. Whatever intelligence guided this phenomenon was offering humanity glimpses of aerospace possibilities that would require generations of research to fully understand and implement through conventional technological development. Dr. Chen's preliminary analysis of the Nevada incident had revealed electromagnetic signatures unlike anything in the published literature, suggesting that the atmosphere above the desert had become a natural laboratory for forces that existed beyond current scientific comprehension. Her instruments detected energy patterns that seemed to respond to observation in ways that violated basic principles of objective measurement, indicating that consciousness itself might play a role in the phenomenon's manifestation. High in the electromagnetic storm, Vivian Blackhawk had discovered that flight could transcend the mechanical interface between pilot and aircraft, creating synthesis between human consciousness and technological capability that approached the mystical experiences described by ancient aviators who claimed to have achieved unity with the sky itself. Through this merger, she was learning to navigate spaces that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional physics. The phenomenon had revealed its true nature as something that existed at the intersection of multiple dimensions of reality, challenging every assumption about the limitations of human flight, while offering practical demonstrations of capabilities that belonged to realms of aerospace development that existed decades ahead of current research. Her journey was becoming an exploration of possibilities that would reshape military aviation if they could be understood and successfully replicated. Her call sign had predicted this moment throughout her entire career, marking her as a pilot capable of navigating spaces that existed beyond the reach of conventional training. The electromagnetic anomaly had recognized this potential, drawing her into realms where the fundamental nature of flight itself could be explored through direct experience rather than theoretical speculation, offering insights that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of controlled movement through three-dimensional space. Radio silence had become complete, cutting her off from the familiar world of regulations and procedures, while connecting her to communication frequencies that seemed to originate from sources beyond terrestrial transmission. Through these alien voices, she was receiving fragmentary instruction in flight techniques that belonged to aerospace capabilities existing far beyond current technology, preparing her for navigation challenges that would test skills she was only beginning to discover. The Nevada desert below had transformed into terrain that obeyed principles beyond conventional geography, revealing landscape features that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, while maintaining enough familiar characteristics to prevent complete spatial disorientation. She was learning to read this transformed topography with instincts that had been developing throughout her career, finding in its impossible geometries a kind of three-dimensional language that communicated navigation information through direct perception rather than instrumental display. Her aircraft's fuel consumption had stabilized at levels that violated thermodynamic principles, yet her engines continued to function normally across all monitored parameters. The electromagnetic phenomenon was sustaining controlled flight through methods that belonged to realms of science existing beyond current theoretical frameworks, offering practical demonstrations of energy systems that would revolutionize aerospace propulsion if they could be analyzed and understood through conventional research methodologies. The stars above had completed their rearrangement into navigational patterns that provided guidance more reliable than any GPS system ever devised, creating a kind of cosmic interface that responded to her consciousness, while indicating optimal flight paths through electromagnetic terrain that existed beyond the reach of conventional mapping technologies. Through these stellar configurations, she was learning to navigate using principles that predated modern aviation by millennia. Ground control's attempts to maintain contact had faded into whispers that belonged to a world she was rapidly transcending, their voices becoming distant echoes in electromagnetic static that marked the boundary between familiar airspace and realms, where flight took on characteristics that challenged every assumption about the relationship between pilot, aircraft, and the infinite sky that contained infinite possibilities for those brave enough to explore beyond conventional limitations. Her breathing had synchronized with the electromagnetic pulses surrounding her aircraft, creating a kind of physiological harmony that enhanced her ability to process information that existed beyond the normal range of human perception. Through this biological attunement to the phenomenon's rhythms, she was developing awareness of flight conditions that transcended mechanical instrumentation, relying instead on consciousness itself as the primary navigational system. The electromagnetic fields painting aurora-like patterns across her canopy had begun revealing structural details of the anomaly that indicated its nature as an intelligence far more sophisticated than atmospheric disturbance. These luminous displays contained information encoded in wavelengths that bypassed conventional visual processing, communicating directly with aspects of consciousness that conventional training never addressed, but which had always formed the foundation of truly exceptional piloting ability. Colonel Martinez refused to classify the incident as pilot error or equipment failure despite mounting pressure from senior officers who wanted to close the investigation and file the report under categories that would prevent uncomfortable questions about phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions underlying military aviation doctrine. Her instincts told her that Wraith 17 had not been lost, but had instead discovered something that would revolutionize their understanding of flight itself. The Nevada incident had begun generating classified reports that would remain sealed in Pentagon archives for decades, creating documentation of phenomena that existed beyond current scientific explanation, while providing evidence that consciousness played a far more significant role in aerospace capabilities than conventional research had ever suspected. These files would eventually form the foundation for aerospace development programs that existed at the intersection of technology and human potential. Dr. Chen's analysis revealed that the electromagnetic anomaly demonstrated characteristics of what theorists had termed consciousness-responsive phenomena, environmental effects that seemed to interact with human awareness in ways that violated fundamental assumptions about the objective nature of physical reality. Her preliminary findings suggested that the Nevada desert had become a natural laboratory for exploring the relationship between mind and matter in contexts that transcended conventional scientific methodology. High above the transformed landscape, Vivian Wraith Blackhawk continued her journey into realms where flight transcended mechanical limitations and approached the mystical experiences described by aviation pioneers who claimed to have achieved perfect unity with the sky itself. Through electromagnetic fields that responded to consciousness as readily as control inputs, She was discovering capabilities that existed beyond the boundaries of current aerospace technology, while remaining grounded in principles of controlled flight that had guided aviation since its earliest days. The phenomenon surrounding her aircraft had revealed its nature as a gateway between dimensions of reality, offering passage to realms where the fundamental laws of physics remained consistent enough to sustain flight, while allowing for possibilities that existed beyond terrestrial limitations. Her navigation through these spaces was becoming an art that combined traditional piloting skills with consciousness techniques that belonged to disciplines that existed at the margins of conventional military training. Her call sign took on new meaning as she realized that the ability to appear and disappear, to move through spaces that other pilots couldn't access, represented literal rather than metaphorical capabilities that had been dormant throughout her career, until activated by contact with the electromagnetic anomaly. The phenomenon had recognized potential in her flying that transcended normal skill levels, drawing her into realms where exceptional ability could be developed and tested against challenges that existed beyond conventional aviation scenarios. Radio communications from terrestrial sources had been replaced by transmission that seemed to originate from intelligence existing beyond current human understanding, offering fragmentary instruction in flight techniques that belonged to aerospace capabilities decades ahead of existing technology. Through these alien voices, she was receiving preparation for navigation challenges that would test skills she was only beginning to discover, suggesting that her journey was leading toward encounters with forces that would reshape her understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. The Nevada desert below continued its transformation into terrain that existed at the intersection of multiple dimensions, revealing geological features that obeyed principles beyond conventional physics, while maintaining enough familiar characteristics to provide spatial reference points for navigation through impossible landscapes. She was learning to read this transformed topography with instincts that bypassed instrumental analysis, finding in its geometric impossibilities a kind of three-dimensional language that communicated directly with consciousness. Her aircraft had evolved beyond its original design specifications, transformed by electromagnetic forces into something that approached the theoretical ideal of perfect flight vehicle, responsive to consciousness as readily as mechanical controls, while maintaining structural integrity necessary for navigation through conditions that would destroy conventional aircraft within moments of exposure to the anomaly's transformative effects. Through this technological evolution, she was exploring possibilities that would revolutionize aerospace engineering if they could be understood and replicated through terrestrial research and development programs. Colonel Martinez maintained her position at the radar console throughout the morning hours, her radar screen remaining stubbornly blank, while her operator's instincts insisted that absence of conventional tracking data didn't indicate catastrophic failure, but rather entry into flight regimes that existed beyond the reach of current monitoring technology. Around her, the control room buzzed with theories and speculation, but she remained focused on the empty display where Blackhawk's signature had vanished, somehow certain that their most skilled pilot was not lost, but transformed by contact with phenomena that challenged everything they thought they understood about the limits of human flight capability. The electromagnetic anomaly continued its mysterious dance through restricted airspace, generating effects that rippled across military installations throughout the continental United States, while maintaining the enigmatic patterns that had first captured the attention of Nellie's air traffic control during the pre-dawn hours, when reality had suddenly become negotiable and conventional aviation doctrine had proven inadequate for comprehending phenomena that existed beyond the boundaries of terrestrial physics and atmospheric science. Dr. Chen's research team had begun arriving at temporary facilities established near the Nevada test site, bringing sophisticated monitoring equipment designed to analyze electromagnetic phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality in contexts that transcended conventional scientific methodology. Her preliminary findings suggested that the atmosphere above the desert had become a natural laboratory for forces that existed at the cutting edge of theoretical physics, offering opportunities for discoveries that would reshape humanity's understanding of controlled flight and its potential for development beyond current technological limitations. High in the electromagnetic storm that had transformed familiar airspace into realms of infinite possibility, Vivian Wraith, Blackhawk continued her exploration of flight conditions that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional training, while remaining grounded in principles of controlled aviation that had guided pilots since the earliest days of powered flight. Her journey was becoming a synthesis of traditional skill and consciousness techniques that belonged to disciplines existing at the margins of current military doctrine, creating capabilities that approached the mystical experiences described by aviation pioneers, who claimed to have achieved perfect unity with the sky itself through methods that transcended mechanical interface between pilot and aircraft. Her aircraft responded to consciousness with precision that eliminated the traditional boundary between human intention and technological capability, creating a synthesis of awareness and engineering that approached the theoretical limits of what was possible within the known laws of aerodynamics, while suggesting possibilities that existed beyond current understanding of the relationship between mind and matter in contexts that challenged every assumption about the limits of human flight potential. Through this merger of consciousness and technology, she was discovering capabilities that would revolutionize military aviation if they could be successfully analyzed, understood, and replicated through conventional research and development methodologies that existed within the boundaries of terrestrial science and engineering disciplines.